Welcome back to these lectures on fiction writing. I hope you're enjoying your studies. In this lecture, we're going to look at characters in fiction stories. It would take several lectures to cover everything about characters and characterization, but for this lecture I just want to cover the basics to help you get started. Possibly later we'll get into a more advanced lecture on characterization. But first, let's look at characters, and how many characters do you really need? Well, you need one at least, the main character, as we often call the protagonist, and you usually need an antagonist. Now, the antagonist doesn't always have to be a human. It could be the weather, it could be God, it could be a family, a group, many other things. But typically you want the protagonist and the antagonist. And the relationship between those two people could carry your story all the way through to the end. I like to see a story have what I call the contagonist. The protagonist is usually the main character, the good guy, and usually the antagonist is the bad guy. The contagonist, in my view, is the person that is there to help the protagonist, the main character. I believe every good story has a romance, and therefore the contagonist is often the romantic interest in my stories. I don't like to see a story have more than three main characters because the relationships get too busy and involved. For example, you have the main character's attitude toward the antagonist, and you have the main character's attitude toward the contagonist. So that's two relationships. You have the antagonist relationship toward the contagonist and the protagonist. So there's four relationships. And then the contagonist has an attitude toward the main character, the protagonist, and an attitude toward the antagonist. That's six characters you got to balance right there. If you add more, it gets even more complex. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have minor characters, or as I call them, backseat drivers. In fact, you should have minor characters to help carry the story along. But most of us like to see a story have at least two and preferably three characters. I believe that characters are the most important element in the story. When you talk to your friends or family about a story you read or a movie you've seen, usually it's the characters you talk about. You don't mention that it was a revenge plot or that it was a romance and things about the plot, but usually you mention actions of the characters or things the characters done or predicaments the characters were in. As I'm sure you're aware, modern-day audiences are very savvy and sophisticated. In order to be an effective writer of any form or genre, you must create believable, credible, and realistic characters to make your story work. And you can only do that by having real knowledge of human nature yourself. And you can't write effectively until you are able to experience your inner self in the process of creating your characters. Your characters, whether they're good characters or bad characters, have to come from inside yourself. So the best writing happens when we dig way down deep in who we are for those characters. If your writing is truly honest, it cannot be separated from who you are. Because there's nobody on earth like you. You're unique. Each of us are created by our different experiences, things that happen to us. So why not put our own memories, our own experiences, our own personal passions into our characters to make believable, real characters? Readers come to the story for entertainment, emotion, and knowledge. And we have to give that to them. We don't want them to walk away disappointed. And more than anything else, a good story helps the reader to feel what the character feels. And thus, the reader will feel less alone and more connected to others. So we have to make our characters as compelling as possible because the stories are about people, about their lives, about their dreams, about dramas sometimes. So the first thing I do to create my characters is to create a backstory for them. I want to know as much about that character as possible before I start putting words on the paper. And I do that by making lists, writing journals, and keeping records of the experiences my character has had. Because knowing a person's past always revises our understanding of who that person is today. Knowing their past helps us to look at them a little bit differently. And as we're creating our character's backstory, we have to create situations that will cause them to react in the way they need to act in order to move the story along. And you have to care about your character. If you don't care about your character, you can't possibly write anything interesting. If you don't believe in your character, then you don't stand a chance to making your reader believe in that character. As a writer, you have to know about your character's past in order to understand what motivates them in the present. So the first step in creating a character is to create sort of a biography of who that character is. In that biography, I start out by creating 3 different categories: the physical aspect, the social aspect, and the emotional aspect of the character. The physical aspect, well, what does a character look like? Are they handsome? The main character doesn't always have to be handsome. Are they extremely handsome, extremely beautiful? Are they strong, fat? Are they thin? Are they ugly? Are they weak in a certain area? First, create the physical aspects of the character. Next, what about the social background of the character? What about their political interest? What neighborhood did they live in as a child? Did they live in the city? Did they live in the rural areas? Were they middle class? The upper class? Are they white, black, Asian? And their emotions. What about their emotional content? Are they insecure? Are they confident? What do they fear? What are their goals? Do they want power? Do they not care about the power? Are they a free spirit? So you'll be well on your way to creating good characters if you'll begin by using these 3 steps and create their physical, their social, and their emotional content. I know when my characters' birthdays are. I know how old they are. I know what their childhood is like. I know what kind of experiences they've had. That way, when my character comes against a situation in a story, I know how that character would react because that's the kind of person they are. Of course, the biography, the journal, the backstory that you create of your character is for your own use. It's to build that person in your mind. The reader will only see perhaps a tip of the iceberg of that character. But because you know who that character is, how they should react, your characters will be believable. They won't be stereotypical. I go as far in creating my characters to assign specific words that they use. Some people say hello, others say hi. Some people say okay, others say all right. Some use the word certainly, others use the word probably. Some people end their sentences with a question, with kind of an add-on tag. I believe it's going to rain today, don't you? That's a nice looking house, isn't it? So the syntax and word usage of a character kind of helps add personality to them. Next, their body language. How does a character react? Are they offensive? Are they thin-skinned? Does any little thing set them off? Do they move slowly? Do they start talking before they enter the room? What's some of their gestures? Are they always chewing gum? Do they keep a cup of coffee near them all the time? Are they jingling the change in their pocket habitually? Do they tug on their ear? Do they blow their nose often? Do they bite or worry their lower lip? Do they refuse to make eye contact? What about their posture? How fast do they talk? How fast do they walk? All these will help make your character more believable and developed. Now, some people like to use a person they know for their character. For example, they might use Aunt Jenny as their main character, and this main character acts and looks and walks and talks like Aunt Jenny. The problem I have with that is my characters are their own entity. And even though I might make that character start out like someone I know, they eventually become their own person and they act differently. So if it works for you, then that's fine, but it hasn't worked for me. Next, let's look at characters' names. Are they really important? Well, you know they are, of course. A person with the nickname of Anvil is a completely different person than one named Walter. Herman and Sledge don't seem like they could be the same person. The name Perry Mason seems very fitting for a lawyer inside a courtroom, as well as the name Festus seems to work well for a scroungy old cowboy. So choose your names well, but also consider the rhythm to your names as well as the pronunciation of your names. For example, one time I read a story whose characters were named something like Mr. Johnson and Mr. Thompson. And all through the story, I had to go back and find my place and re-establish who Mr. Johnson was because I were getting the two mixed up because their names were so similar. So keep your names completely different for your characters, and that'll help the reader keep their place. I also find that it's helpful if I make one character's name a single syllable and another character's name 2 syllables or more. I'll make one character's name start with a vowel and another character's name start with a consonant. And this seems to help the reader keep their place. Of course, there's exceptions always, but we're looking at starting places here. In the next lecture, we'll look at archetypes for your characters, stereotypes, places to start with your characters.